You're with Julian on the brown note. I said I would never use this analogy, which a friend of mine used, but on a 37-degree day in Sydney, sweating like a rapist in a holding cell. A review of DarkSide's new album, which is called, I'll get there in a minute, but the new album by DarkSide, which is a collaborative from Nicolas Jaar. Born in New York in 1990, one of the MVPs of music in the world today, makes electronic music to a degree. I saw him live and it was mind-blowing as a solo act as well. Really established himself with Space Is Only Noise, or as the song itself, the title track says, Space Is Only Noise You Can See. Which came out in 2011 and was a landmark electronic music album with vocal passages and songs on there, such as the incredible title track. Just checking where things are going. That was an establishing album. As a solo artist, he's released a lot. Some of it has been more in the vein of Space Is Only Noise as a full-blown solo project. Others have been relating to the circumstances under which the album was made. There was a long gap. There was Pomegranates, which I think related to a film project, and Nymphs, which may have been the same. Sirens is the next album I actually got, which is very good as well, and reminded me a little bit actually of Floating Points, Sam Shepard, in the way that Sam Shepard's albums as Floating Points have moved quite substantially, dependent on the release. We got that Pharaoh Soundless thing, we got the Mojave Desert thing, which is all like ambient noise in the Mojave Desert, and he's done the same sort of thing. Telas as well, another strong album. Last year I didn't get to review Piedras 1 and 2, so he's got a lot of solo albums. And he's somewhere between James Holden and Floating Points in his solo discography, which is actually longer than both put together, I think. Piedras 1 and 2 were very interesting. They came out at the end of last year, so I didn't review them. One was much more sort of analogous to Space Is Only Noise, and the other was much more sort of ambient. And they related to a 5-hour broadcast he did on Chilean radio, which related to the Pinochet regime and political upheaval in Chile and dictatorships and so on, with an analogous context to Palestine and what was happening there. And he trimmed that down into 2 albums, and it was very good. I really liked it. I didn't review it, but already he's back. Now, that would be a very strong discography for any electronic music artist. But he also released 2 fantastic albums as Against All Logic, a project which is just him making clubbier music like Caribou. Also, Dan Snaith releases more album-based projects as Caribou, and then more individual track dance projects as Daphne. And that's the same kind of style as Against All Logic, more club collection tracks. But those 2 albums, 2012 to 2017 and 2017 to 2019, were 2 of the best albums of each year. Came out in 2018 and 2020, both magnificent. So that is, again, adding him up. But then you get DarkSide, which is a 3rd project, and that was initially him and Dave Harrington, a guitarist. Very wisely they've added, I'm not going to get this right, Tlacael Esparza. Tlacael Esparza? Maybe I got it right, I don't know, as a live drummer. And they are probably closest to The Smile, the Radiohead project, as a 3-piece in the current formation of DarkSide. DarkSide initially released Psychic. Actually, they released, I think, basically this was a way of stoner at home post-clubbers that wanted to listen to something like Dark Side of the Moon, and creating that in a sort of Moon Safari-esque way very successfully. It was a brilliant album, Psychic. I think it was preceded by a bunch of cut-ups that came out like that first Run the Jewels release, which wasn't really an album so much as everything they've been playing around with in the studio. But Psychic was a very much landmark album in 2013 of very progressive psychedelic electronic music, which was analogous to the kind of vibe you get listening to a Pink Floyd album in a way. Spiral in 2021 didn't get as much traction. It was still a perfectly fine album. It just wasn't as interesting. In that period they added the live drummer and became an even more honed live environment. I'm definitely seeing them live. I've seen Nicolas Jaar live on his own. It was very good. But to have Dave Harrington and the drummer, and he does these sort of like epic listening experience live events, which are very appealing. And their new album Nothing has come out. Overall, it might be the best thing they've ever done. The opener SLAU, it's got this sort of progressive house synth vibe. It's a very much an opener rather than a fully blown track. So I think this and the end are both tracks that are serving a purpose rather than being fully developed as songs. Not for the only time on this album, I was reminded of the progressive house vibes of the immortal Leftism by Left Field. It's a very low-key scene setter, and one of the prominent elements that will appear throughout the album is Nicolas Jaar's own voice is used in so many different ways on this album. It's very distorted in this one. And there's also a little bit of a female singer, which I didn't notice coming up too much. Very sort of dub sound system vibe. The second track is a run of probably 2, 3 and 4 and maybe 5, which would have made an all-time classic electronic EP. Just amazing songs where the earlier DarkSide music, could be an 8-minute song with expected progressions. These are like all 6-minute long epics that completely change throughout their process, which is fantastic. SNC is amazing. It's also the entrance to the restless heart of this album. It's got an arresting bass pattern and just drops into this very sort of 70s funk sequence, and more vocals again, and different people's vocals here, full on disco stomp as the whole thing comes together. And if I am critical of this album, it's some of the times I felt like this track was all build and come down and transition, whereas I wouldn't have minded the actual full-blown track to have existed for a lot longer of its duration rather than continually dropping off, because it sounded so great. And Are You Tired? Another outstanding track, again in the 6-minute pocket. Falsetto vocals this time from Mr. Jaar, and it's got this really gentle beatless guitar figure, and then sort of this unexpected drop into like country rock. And the live drumming is an absolute boon to this band. I can only imagine that first DarkSide album with this drummer, and that's why it reminds me so much of The Smile, because you've got your Tom York, Johnny Greenwood, and you've got the drummer. I can't remember his name, even though I've got about 3 albums, but it really does add. I think I'm found myself, because I'm reviewing them back to back, comparing to not particularly analogous, but in some ways spirits in Panda Bear and Nicolas Jaar, and the fact that a lot of Panda Bear's music seems to be made at home, create a drum pattern on a drum machine and just leave it running for the whole song, whereas here the drumming is outstanding often. And it's the one with Dave Harrington's guitaring really carries the whole thing. Nice 90s rave synths sort of come in again when this song really goes for it in certain directions. I wish there'd been more. And then you get Groucho Max, probably the most initially outstanding track and most unexpected, full-blown post-punk swamp vibe, swamp blues vibe. It reminded me a bit of Tom Waits Going Down South era. And it's got this great sort of sawdust piano break, and it takes off again. And all of that happens in 1 minute and 30 seconds. It travels so far and fast. I think some critics have actually attacked this album for doing that too much. I don't know that I would say that I would attack it for doing that too much. I would just say that when the song has settled into something amazing, I'd rather it lasted longer. And there's an ascending guitar line where it goes doo, 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 which reminded me of a song, and I don't know if it's a Pink Floyd song, but again, drums, again, like towards the end of the song, it goes into this full-blown prog house vibe, very leftism. American References is probably the closest to that title track, Space Is Only Noise, with some Spanish vocals. He does a lot of his vocals in Spanish, and if the previous track was a guitar-based track for Dave Harrington, this is much more for the drummer. There's a lot of incredible percussion. It comes across as a mid-set cleanser after 3 mini epics in a row. Somewhere sort of between early LCD sound system and minimal techno at times as well. It's sort of like a gentler, less changing track. By 6, we come into, like the Panda Bear album, the first sort of half of the album is in one vibe, whereas it sort of changes into, if not just softer territory, but less frenetic territory. And I did write down Air Moon Safari, which is its own DarkSide album in its own way. For Heaven is Good for This. It's a little bit anonymous, that track, until the percussion and the shoegazy breakdown. I wouldn't have minded them concentrating on the wilder elements, which sounds trite to say on an album that's been criticised for being too all over the shop and too wild, but I wouldn't have minded them being a bit more punishing. You get a 1-2 here, Hell Sweet Part 1 and 2. The first has an almost sort of David Lynch, Twin Peaks musical vibe, some really nice syncopated drumming going on, almost like underwater 60s soul, Bobby Darin sort of stuff. Again, probably quite close to Panda Bear, but a little bit more interesting, croonerish vocal. Imagine All the People, done in it starts with a John Lennon vibe, and it says, imagine all the people living in hell. I thought the second half, Hell Sweet Part 2, was even stronger. Another sort of Neverworld soul track. Some very nice bass playing on this one, and some high-pitched distorted vocals and embellishments, but all hiding a really quite lovely track. And the end, Sin el soy no hay nada, which I, with my impeccable Spanish, read as without the sun I don't have anything. I'm pretty sure, and that's a bit of a Bad Bunny kind of vibe from Bad Bunny's most recent album. It almost sounds like, a slightly political, disenfranchised vibe going on there. It's got a bit of a Café Del Mar vibe and Gregorian multi-tracked vocals. Like, he uses his vocals so well on this album in so many different ways, and again, the wall of feedback, the wall of pure mid to early 90s shoegaze feedback. I wanted to go on for 10 minutes, and you just get like a minute and a half, which was devastating. If you've ever heard of the band Fuck Buttons, who I love, when they do these very sort of prog house tracks but then overstack them with guitar feedback, it really reminded me of that, and I wish it had gone on more. Now, I think I've changed the way that I review albums with this album, because what I normally do is I'll have it on in the background over the course of a week, and then I'll sit there and stare at it and review it. I'll probably listen to it 3 times to 6 times over the course of a week, never less than 3, and then sit there and listen to each track. I think with this album I was down marking it by doing that staring at it, because it is still outstanding to stare at. But I did notice how much I was enjoying it, like not noticing any flaws when I was not focusing on it so hard, and that kind of made me feel like you don't really listen to albums like that, where you sit down and stare at them. So I was going to give it an 8.5, which is not far away what I'm going to give it anyway for just staring at it, but I was wondering whether to give it an 8. But I listened to it again afterwards, and it's like, no, I've enjoyed this album more than anything this year. I think Squid I gave an 8.5 to as my highest so far this year, but I'm going to give DarkSide nothing, because of the combination of staring at it and noting occasional parts that I would have liked improved on, and a bit too much variety in the face of maintaining what was already great, alongside the fact that listening to it while you're walking around, constantly being dragged back to it by thrilling passages. I'm going to give DarkSide Nothing a 9 out of 10, and my favourite album of the year so far.